presentation. Following that presentation, I'll take you over to my looms and do some demonstrations on my looms this morning and answer some questions that you have. Then you're going to have some time to weave and start weaving samples. So I emailed everybody the workshop instructions, which were the treadling variations that I want you to try in the workshop. They are not ones that you absolutely have to like stick to, but they will enhance your understanding of how your weave structure is behaving as a block. And then we kind of break for, well, when you're away weaving on your own, I will say that we will come back together 1 o'clock Central Time, and then I'll have everybody measure their picks per inch, and we'll just do a check-in so that we can make sure that you're not beating too hard, you're not beating too lightly. There are, I find usually that when working with so many different aspects of the deflected double weave, a lot of weavers, can have difficulty if they get off on their picks per inch. So we'll talk about that later this morning, and then you'll report out on that. Then you'll have some more time to weave samples. And then at 3:30 today Central Time, we're going to meet back on Zoom, and I'm going to give you some finishing and washing instructions for both your samples and your finished project, so to speak, so that you'll know like how I do them differently and maybe what you can anticipate and do differently too, to get some of the results that you want to achieve in your finished project. So usually at the conclusion of day one, after you've washed your samples, I have everybody send me either a text or photographs, or with photographs of your wash samples, because what I do is I'm going to put them into a PowerPoint starting tonight and tomorrow morning as the sample pictures start to come in. And we actually begin our discussion of day two with a very collaborative process of you talking about your washed samples and what you're experiencing and seeing in them, what you're loving in them. You may find some things, maybe that you don't particularly love. Maybe it's an issue with a set of a fiber that you thought maybe was one fiber and turned out to be another. So I might have some set recommendations for you, or it might be a color issue, or it's just usually a kind of like, here's what I've done so far, and here's where I think I'm going to go with the rest of the day, so that I know how to help you with your remaining warp. And some participants choose to weave more samples. That's up to you. It depends upon where you are in the process. But many participants choose to weave like a scarf or a Mobius or whatever it is with your remaining warp, because we really don't use too many or too much, maybe 15 to 18 inches or so maximum for samples. It's usually enough to inform your decision about what you like or maybe what you don't care for. And I usually have you try, if you don't have any Zephyr or any wool-based yarn in your work, I usually have you try some Zephyr or wool-based yarn in your weft, so that you can see how it behaves differently. Should you try to maybe weave the same draft down the road again, to see how it's going to behave. I had one participant in the last workshop I did, which was the Sacramento Weavers Guild, and some of you may know Diane Smith, who used to be one of the business partners for the Joy Yarns or Just Our Yarns. Those ladies are no longer dyeing tencel. They're great dyers, but they're retired from that, but they're still weaving. So she changed her entire weft choice of her crackle draft that she was doing, just on the basis of just trying that in the sample because it turned out to be so much better than what she had envisioned. So, but every weaver is different. But, you know, I do like the experimentation of fibers so that you know what it's going to do down the road. Even if you don't choose to weave it in a final sample or your final project, you'll know a lot more about how it can behave in deflected double weave. And then on the end of day 2, we meet back on Zoom, certainly with another presentation, and I kind of give you a little bit further information about where you can go from here, some different things that I have done that maybe you didn't get to try in the workshop, but maybe, you know, that gives you some thinking for down the road. Because I absolutely love this weave structure. And I think once you, I think the more you work with it, the more you will come to learn about deflected double weave and love it as much as I do. So that's just kind of some of my hopes for you. So that's an overview of where we're going for the day. So I'll go ahead and ask for Laura to spotlight the morning presentation with you, which is just the overview and refresher of some rules that deflected double weave adheres to. Okay. So I'd like to start by going over some resources, both for, you know, that I have in putting together this workshop. So in 2019, I was awarded the Mid-Atlantic Fiber Association Fellow, or a fellowship. And it was a class taught by Ruby Leslie. It was a round robin class on deflected double weave. And really, my goal with that fellowship was to go back and start working on weaving deflected double weave of my own, and putting together a presentation for one of my sponsoring guild, which was the Fredericksburg Spinners and Weavers Guild of Virginia, which Virginia is where I'm originally from. But I just started weaving and sampling and reading so much that I just kind of got, I just grew to love it. And there are still so much that I want to try. But here's some valuable resources that I found earlier on. And one of them is, this is a photograph of the cover. It's the Best of Hand Woven. It is an ebook deflected double weave technique series. It has 15 projects in them. Believe it or not, I have not ever woven any of the actual projects, but one of the threadings in them is a rose path threading, or what I call a rose path threading. And that is certainly one I have done a lot of extensive weaving with. But there is a list of resources compiled by Madeline Vanderhoot, which I absolutely love. And that gave me more places to study resources for deflected double weave and where the publications were. And actually, when you look at that list compiled by Madeline, that list of published material, the earliest deflected double weave showed up in about 1957, I believe, by Mary Miggs Atwater. And so it is, when you compare it to many other historical weaves, it is, I guess, a relatively newer weave when you consider the vast extension of history of a lot of other things, such as twills, so to speak. So that was a great resource for me to do a lot of reading with. And then, fortunate enough at that time, around 2020 or the beginning of 2020, Double with a Twist was published by Marian Stubenetsky. And I thought, oh my gosh, I just loved her Echo and Iris books. So I have to have that resource too as well. So that gave me another book for further information, exploration, resources, drafts, you know, not necessarily having everything that I really, you know, wanted, because no one resource I think can provide it all, but that is certainly where my inspiration and where some of my threading variation came forward for what is Crackle in this workshop. So of course, in Double with a Twist, it's a much more expanded version of what she calls crackle. So mine is just certainly a variation of that, but that is certainly where you see a lot of deflected double weave that are referred to as crackle come from. And then also I had this book long on hand, and probably many of you do too as well. The Book of 8 Shaft Patterns by Carol Strickler is such a fabulous weaving book for 8 shafts. And patterns beginning with numbers, let's see, 758 to about 763 are dedicated to deflected double weave. So there again, I've tried many of the patterns in this book, and it is the one that I call brocade that comes from a variation of this book. And it's one I absolutely love. And it is the one that I just recently published my weaving project on. That's on the cover of Handwoven magazine. Another resource I'll share with you probably more tomorrow is Exploring Woven Fabrics by Janet Phillips. That book again is not dedicated explicitly to deflected double weave, but she does have a good number of deflected double weave samplers and information in that book as well. So I will share some more of that with you tomorrow, but those are some fabulous resources. They're certainly not alone. And some of the resources, I know Denise Kovnat has been an exceptional resource to me, and certainly inspiration as well. So let's go ahead and let's kind of move ahead to, let me give you the actual true definition as it was defined by Madeline Vanderhoot and Marian Stupanetsky. A lot of people certainly agree that it's a lot easier to weave than it is to describe it. Now, whenever you weave deflected double weave, you're going to have one of three things happening or going on. You're going to have areas of plain weave, you're going to have areas of warp floats, and you're going to have areas of weft floats. And so on the front and the back of the cloth, you're going to have one of those things going on. For example, like brocade, you have threaded in that area where you threaded blocks on shafts or heddles 3 and 4, it is separated by 2 strands of a different yarn on 5 and 6. And then it repeats a couple of times. So what's happening is those areas of 3 and 4 are actually coming together and weaving plain weave on the face of the cloth. And the yarns that you've threaded on 5 and 6 are actually going to deflect to the back of the cloth and weave warp floats on the back. So anyways, here is how Stupanetsky defines it. She says that it's a weave structure using 2 shuttles. And this is where it's kind of a word for word quote there. 2 warp and weft sets, such that if one pair of warp and weft sets is removed, there is still a viable weave left. And then she goes on to say the layers are exchanging as warp blocks of one block float, or one color float over weft blocks, and in the other direction the weft blocks float over warp blocks. So that's Stupanetsky. Vanderhoot, a little bit maybe more simplistic approach. She defines it as groups of threads in one weave interact with groups of threads from another in both the warp and the weft. And then the threads will slide above or below one another and move into adjacent float areas. So that's the deflection that we have that is going on. And I love how she talks about that, them sliding above or below. So you'll actually start to see that happen if set appropriately on the loom when you'll actually start to weave. Sometimes you'll see, you can't see all the threads because they're deflecting and floating to the back of the cloth, so to speak. So it's just such a wonderful definition. And then that deflection is enhanced. When you take it off tension, you'll see the deflection even more But then after washing and finishing, you'll really see what can happen. And you can actually get a lot of deflection even with tencel. So that's a little bit about what it is. So if we it adheres to certain rules as well. So if we advance to the next slide, these are our threading and treadling rules that are just inherent or things to keep in mind when you're working with weaving any type of deflected double weave. So because deflected double weave is a block weave, you can, it adheres to all block weave rules. So, and in this case, is a block is going to be defined as 2 or more threads that are interacting together as a unit. Now, in this case, and in many cases, or most cases, you do see the blocks with either 4 ends or 6 ends in deflected double weave. I have chosen blocks of threadings for the workshop of 4 ends or 6 ends as a maximum, but you certainly can have 10 or 12 ends in a block followed by 6 in it with a different block. So there's many different threadings and options that are available, but I've chosen 4 end blocks and 6 end blocks because I think it's easier to teach and demonstrate, I suppose. And so I'm always looking for 4 or 6 end types of things. I will show you some other samples where I have woven bigger blocks. Okay, as I mentioned before, you must have areas of plain weave, and you've got to have areas where you're going to have warp and weft floats. Now, you can also vary the number of ends in the block. So, and this is important perhaps maybe to use or of most significance, because in this workshop, or maybe in some of the samples that I've chosen to show you, especially also tomorrow, one of the things that is prevalent, I will say, in my weaving is I do sometimes vary the number of ends in even the treadling. And here's why I do that. Sometimes when I am working with a different size fiber, maybe it's the right color, but I am working with maybe a different size fiber. I might treadle 2 or more picks, or I might treadle just 2 more weft picks, just for a couple things. Like if it's a finer fiber, I want to show up a little bit more. I don't want it to be too scant. Like let's say if I'm mixing sometimes some 8-2 and 5-2. So I might have a reason to treadle more, or more often it happens when I weave, like, let's say I might try a 22 weight. And maybe it's a 5-2 bamboo weight, which seems to be a little bit heavier to me than a 5-2 tencel for some reason. So there are reasons that I vary those number ends in the treadling, and that's maybe to get it to show up more. Or it might be a design distinction. I might have a beautiful hand-dyed blazing shuttles weft that I want to use. So I might throw 2 more weft picks to get the beautiful hand-dyed yarn to show up a little bit more. So that's why I kind of adhere to that rule, or, you can vary the number of ends in each block. Just because the pattern, maybe calls for 6 picks, or the treadling maybe calls for 6 picks, doesn't mean that always has to be so. So, and certainly the other thing I love about it is you can weave treadlet trompus root, but there's so many design possibilities, because as you're weaving your samples, you'll be able to decide what block designs or what designs you like the best. And in your final project, you can kind of pick out which blocks you like to weave, which colors you like to weave. So you can have your own distinct designs that come up based upon what you like, or based upon, the way you might want to treadle it together. So you can get sometimes a totally different look. So those are the kind of like the rules, and I'll try to refer back to them in the workshop, or I may tell you, you might want to try a couple more weft picks in a certain yarn as you're experimenting with maybe some of your weft yarns, because hopefully you have some weft yarns that are picked out that are the same as the yarns that you're using in the warp, or some other like maybe items in your bobbin stash that you may want to try. Okay, so moving ahead, let's talk about the sets a little bit more. So I gave you the sets for where to start out with, because I wanted you to be set up for success with your fibers in the projects that you've chosen. But once you start experimenting a little bit more, a lot of questions are usually going to come forward to, or Natalie, how do you approach the set? Or how do you know I have this fabulous fiber, so I'm not sure what to set it at. So what would you recommend? Well, if I haven't woven with the fiber, I probably wouldn't have a strong recommendation, but there's many fibers that I have woven with, and I have a published set chart that works for that. But here is what I do when I'm weaving with an unknown fiber or a new fiber that's new to me in deflected double weave. I will look at the range of the manufacturer's set for that fiber. So like when I try to buy a yarn, it's usually published on Webs. I know Catherine Weber, she would publish it originally on her website. What was the range of, what was the manufacturer recommending for plain weave? And what would they recommend for twill? So I always try to determine that, or research that, or look that up. And then I'll start usually by setting it with the plain weave, or what is recommended by that manufacturer for plain weave. And then I might set it sometimes just a little bit higher, but not as high as usually you might weave for a twill. I will say that my sets are oftentimes maybe more open for especially scarves. I do like a beautiful drape in a scarf. Sometimes maybe my sets are a little bit more open or more lacy than other weavers might recommend. That's just something that I have found. Also, one of the things that I found earlier on in my reading was what was up with Zephyr, because 18-2 Zephyr seemed to have a range of sets, anywhere from 16 EPI, and it's a lace weight yarn, to 24 EPI. So, and, I guess through the course of my studying and weaving a lot of samples, if you want more fulling, if you want more deflection or bubbliness, you want to set your Zephyr closer to 16 EPI. If you want less of that, then I usually recommend a set of 24 EPI. So if you used, and sometimes it depends on the pattern. So if you used Zephyr in your brocade for your warp, I would have had you set it closer to 24 EPI. And the reason being is this: you can control the amount of shrinkage and the amount of fulling, a little on, so to speak, by controlling the sets of some of your wool-based yarns. So that's what I'm doing when I say to set the Zephyr at 24 EPI in your brocade. I'm doing that with explicit purpose, because I think with that particular scarf, I think it looks best with a moderate deflection, so that it lays fairly flat versus really bubbly, so to speak. So that's my process for any time I am starting to work with putting together and mixing fibers of unknown yarns. Is looking at that range of that manufacturer set and then starting with a plain weave. Okay, and let's talk a little bit more. Let's see if we advance to the next slide. Let's talk about, okay, so in deflected double weave, your shuttles, you're always going to be working with 2 shuttles, and you're going to weave a block of weft threads at one time, meaning back and forth from pick to pick, selvage to selvage, before you change your shuttles. So this can be different for you if you've never woven it before, in that it's different from overshot. Like overshot, you might weave a pattern pick and then you might throw a tabby, then maybe 2 pattern picks and then throw another tabby. So you always have that tabby pick pretty much following, 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 pattern picks of overshot. So in deflected double weave, you might weave 6 picks with 1 shuttle before you pick up the next. So you have some choices of how are you going to treat your yarns. Well, the first thing that you can always do is that you can always carry your yarns up the side. And if you're like me and like to change yarns a lot of the times, you might carry 2 different color yarns up one side, the right side, and you might carry 2 colored yarns or different colored yarns up the left-hand side. So I did that with Marianne Stupanetsky's book. She has a pattern in the back that was a 4-layer deflected double weave. So I was weaving them and I decided to carry them up the side. I was working with, 4 shuttles at one time, and that was just the easiest for that particular weave structure at that time. This was about 2 years ago, but I've learned a lot more since then. So when I'm changing colors or when you're changing weft colors, you can always bury the weft yarn. And what I mean by burying it is in an open shed, I would take that yarn, throw a weft pit, bury the tail of it underneath the bottom thread or bottom outside thread of the shed, and like carry it back in about an inch in the same shed, so to speak, and beat it. So usually I find with deflected double weave, you don't really see that too much. I don't get into too much splicing unless I've run out of bobbin thread, and then I'll splice a color together. So that's an option you have. Sometimes, depending upon the size of the yarn, I might splice it when I bury the ends, but some of the finer yarns, and especially if I'm weaving with some really forgiving yarns that are sticky, such as anything with wool or even Tessa silk, it's not so much that it's sticky, but it's grabby. And it likes to grab those tensile fibers. So I'm always burying, when I'm changing a color, I'm always burying it behind about an inch in, behind a sticky or grabby yarn, so that it kind of helps adhere to it. But the other thing that you can do is you can practice shuttle diving, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate in the workshop this morning. And that is, how do you make 2 selvages, an inner selvage or an outer selvage? Oh, okay. Mona's asked a question. It says, what do you mean by splice? Okay. So one of the things that I learned as a weaver earlier on was I took a workshop with Tom Nicely and his daughter, Sarah Nicely Bixler. And they, I guess, were really the ones that first showed me how to splice a yarn. So if you take a 2-ply yarn, you would kind of unravel it, maybe back in an inch or so, and then you would cut one of the unraveled parts, leaving kind of the 2-ply and then 1-ply here. So, and then I would take, so that would be the end of where I'd run out of bobbin thread. I would splice that. Then I would take my beginning yarn that was 2-ply, and then unwind it. I don't know if you're able to see my fingers here. And then I will cut off one of those of the 2-ply back an inch or so. And then it will be left with 1-ply, so that when it's put together on top of each other, whoops, you have those threads that just kind of sit on top of each other, so to speak. So it looks like a 2-ply in your finished project. So hopefully that explains a little bit about what splicing. Okay, Mona says got it. Okay, good. So, but when I run out of bobbin threads, that's when I splice. Or when if I'm weaving with a heavier yarn and laying in a certain color, that's when I'll splice. It takes a amount of time to do that. So, but back to shuttle diving. So Lisa Hill has, I think it's Elizabeth Hill. Elizabeth Hill has some fabulous, and Madeline Vanderhoot on demonstrations on shuttle diving with just working with 2 yarns. The most I've ever done shuttle diving on is 3. And I created a video last summer, and it's on YouTube and it's on my website, when I was creating 3 selvages and weaving consecutively with 3 different colors of bobbins and shuttle diving with those. So that's usually the most I do. The rest of the yarns, I usually am just comfortable with cutting off and bearing those colors. So, but when I practice shuttle diving, the idea is you're going to have one selvage that's going from one weft color that's going from outer selvage to outer selvage as it weaves back and forth with the weft picks. And it's usually, I usually try to keep the color consistent with whatever the yarn color is at my selvage. Not always, but that's sometimes helpful. But what it does is it makes for a very nice finishing process at the selvage. The second yarn or weft yarn is going to travel from inner selvage to inner selvage. So since it's not traveling across, you're going to have to make a conscious decision to shuttle dive. And what that means is that yarn is going to go up and down through the cloth and through your selvage from the front and the back as it travels from inner selvage to inner selvage. So whatever method you choose, whether you carry it up the side, and sometimes some weavers say, I'm not ready to focus on that. I'm just going to focus on my colors and getting my beat. And so that's up to you, but I hope that you will try it and practice it while you have me here in the workshop so that you can ask, questions about that. But whatever method you choose, it's going to look beautiful, and it's going to look nice. Your goal is always the same. And your goal is always to avoid a curving selvage when you're weaving deflected double weave. You don't want it to curve up, or you don't want it to curve down. In other words, your cloth should be pretty flat when it's on the loom. So if you're curving up and down, you'll definitely know that you're pulling in too tight, so to speak, either on the front or the back. Now, you may get some cases where you might get scallops forming. You can see maybe in this picture at the bottom right corner where it goes, my weft goes in a little bit. So a little bit of scalloping is certainly okay. And it can actually be quite pretty. Sometimes also when you have wool, you just don't want to have a selvage that's curving up or down. You want to be able to have your finished product lay flat if necessary without it curling up, so to speak. Okay, so I've got some photographs of, if we can scroll to the next slide, here's a close-up of what's happening. So I know it's hard to see the different colors here because they're similar colors, but this is, for example, the brocade, and I've got a tencel on the outer selvage there, and it's kind of a purpley color. and then I've got a charcoal gray on the inner selvage. So what's making up my outer selvage on the brocade is yarns that are threaded on 3 and 4. They're making plain weave. Sometimes that is called the A block, my outside block in that case, and then the B block would be where my inner selvage is, and that's threaded on 5 and 6. So what's happening here is when I'm starting to weave, I am noticing that when I have to carry my weft across and I'll show you which block it is when I treadle it, it's going to appear on, you might make a note of this in your directions. It's going to happen on brocade when you hit treadle 7, or what I define as block D as in dog. So what's happening is you're going to have to enter the open shed from the back or underneath side of the cloth, the very first pick. And then once it's set up and you're weaving and treadling 7, 8 and block D, you will not have to exit the shed until you get to the last weft pick of 7 and 8, which is on treadle 8. So it'll just naturally, once you enter into that shed, it'll just naturally catch on your inner selvages, because one inner selvage is down on the bottom of the shed, open shed, and one of those yarns is up or on the upper part of the open shed. So that's just a little bit of an overview. So you'll see it more in the actual example. Okay, so if we scroll ahead to the next slide, it shows that I'm exiting, and you can do this on an open shed or a closed shed. And so that's me on a closed shed. I'm finishing the last weft pick and I'm carrying it basically between the inner and outer blocks. And I like to use a thin shacked boat shuttle for shuttle diving for that inner selvage yarn, because it creates less stress on the warp. So that's what I like to use. So if you have a shuttle that is finer, thinner, so to speak, that would be the one that you would want to use, is when you're carrying your weft yarn on that inner shuttle or inner selvage. Okay, and then let's scroll ahead to, let me show you an example here. Now this is not either of the patterns that you are particularly weaving, but it is a good picture of a close-up that I wanted to show. So here I've got an inner and outer selvage, and my inner selvage is created, my pointer finger and my thumb are actually on my inner selvage there. And it is a kind of a golden coppery yarn. It's actually a tencel in the warp. And then it's interacting with a mahogany weft. So I could actually, what's underneath my pointer finger is the outer selvage, which is a 5-2 eggplant tencel. So this is an all tencel example. If you notice above my pointer finger, you can see that my mahogany weft yarn, I'm actually using the same weft color there, but it is now interacting with my outer selvage, and you can see it going across, and you can see it actually is forming a weft pick over what is actually warp floats on the back of the cloth that you can, that are, those warp floats are the 5-2 kind of like the rusty colored yarn. So not as pronounced with the brocade and the crackle because of the number of ends I've chosen. In this case, I was weaving with probably 8 or 12 weft picks. Let's see, or even 6 or so. So I was weaving with a lot. So that little hole, so to speak, between the inner and outer selvage is kind of enhanced a little bit more. It's larger because of the number of weft picks, but you technically could put your hand in between the inner and outer selvage, or a little finger. Again, not quite as pronounced as this, but that basically is giving you the idea of what happens. So I just kind of want to point that out. And the goal is always to have both sides be the same, if possible, so that both selvages look the same. Now, you will always find, and I find this still too, that one selvage will look a little better than another. But like, for example, in some patterns, if you carry it up the side in deflected double weave, you will have a lot more openness on one side or on the other side than the opposing side of which you're carrying it up the side. So sometimes, again, that's just experimenting more with shuttle diving. Okay, and then if we scroll ahead to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about picks per inch. Now I'm going to go over the more details about it later when we go to the looms. But when I ask you to measure picks per inch, I want you to count the total number of yarn ends within an inch, even if they are different fibers, sizes. So even if you can't always see the fibers, like maybe because they're deflecting to the back, I still want you to count them, because technically that matters. I want everybody to measure their picks per inch when we come back and report back at 1 o'clock, so that everybody is measuring the same. And the easiest way to do that is to, I think, put a tape measure down on your loom and take a photograph of that, and then enlarge it so you can count the number of picks per inch. But this scarf on the very left is a fold deflected double weave. I call it rose path. It's the rose path threading. And then in the center, that is also the rose path threading and treadling trimpes with different colors, using Tussa silk and Zephyr. And then I'm also using one of those Joy yarns, Just Our Yarn, hand dyed 10-2-10 cell. So, and then the very right hand photo shows a sample of it completely fold. And if you notice the Joy yarn, it's the yarn that's kind of in the center, that's bluish green, is just a little bit lacy and bubbly. And that's because that was set at 24 EPI. I've woven it in different projects, and the more appropriate set is about 30 EPI for the Joy yarns. So, but because I was using it as a limited amount, it didn't bother me. But so that will be some of the things that we'll maybe be talking about on day 2 tomorrow, after you wash your finished samples. If you get to have that occurring and you want to know, why that is, we'll talk a little bit more about set and maybe what you could do to adjust that. Okay, from the center photo, we would count, let me see. Yeah, let me go over that. Yes, it is about 16 EPI, might be 18. Let me take a close look at that. All right, we've got 8 ends of the Zephyr, which is the indigo yarn. We've got another 8 ends. Yep, that is a good 16 EPI. Now that is rose path. I will say probably with brocade, you're going to get closer to 18 EPI. What you are striving for, so that was good, Laura. Does everybody see how I did that? I just kind of enlarged it. Hopefully it showed up as enlarged on your screen so I could count the number of ends more easily. I noticed that even
Natalie,
though
I didn't see it enlarged.
Okay. And probably I enlarged it for myself, but probably I would have to have Laura, since she is hosting it, to see if she could enlarge that screen.
She just did it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the best method for you, and also I'm going to put my phone number in chat. I always do this too. Whenever you're weaving or you have a question, I'm always going to want to see a picture of what's going on, because the reason being is sometimes, first of all, I'm a visual person and I can see a lot better what's going on than maybe you might be describing it. Sometimes I'm also able to pick up on other things when I look at your pictures that you may not be able to pick up on, or, maybe it's not inherent to you yet, that I'm able to further help you with. So I just put, and this is a number certainly to write down during the course of the workshop. If you need to send me any photos to take a look at, my cell phone number is 260-615-8830. So I put that in chat for everybody. So that's an easy way to send me photos, or if you want to do it via Messenger, some people don't want to text. You can do that in Messenger and say, you can get on Zoom and take yourself off mute. Say, Natalie, this is Kathy or whoever. I just sent you some photographs in Messenger. Can you please take a look? So that's always very helpful to me, that I can take a look at pictures of your weaving to try and help you with that. So, okay, so that's how I'm going to want you to measure picks per inch for our 1 o'clock report out today. And then let's talk just a little bit more about color. The last slide. Okay, so here is brocade. And here is one color approach that you can use. Now in this, I was weaving with a 5-2 tencel. And the 5-2 tencel was actually dyed by Sid's Threads out of North Carolina. I was giving hers a try, and it's actually interacting with about 4 or so 5-2 tencel hand dyed wefts. And those are making the large squarish looking shapes. I'm also weaving with the Autumn Spice Tussa Silk. And then I'm weaving with what I call is the Dragonflies. And that's threaded on shafts 7 and 8. That makes what I call the little dragonflies. They're warp floats. And then they have these little kind of weft float wings, and I kind of think that they look like dragonflies, so to speak. So one of the things that I did with this particular one was, it was starting to look too orange to me, and I wanted to get a lot more color. And the color I went for, rather than the color popping, was creating what I call color depth. I was using a similar value. What I mean by that is I was using a similar value of yarn, but in a different color, but it was creating some depth. And what I was doing, so I didn't have to cut it off and bury it so much, is I was doing it alternating a mahogany colored tencel, and I was doing it on treadles 3 and 4. And alternating it every other repeat. So when I would hit to 3 and 4, I would do like the Tussa Silk, and then I would go to the next repeat of the pattern. I'd throw in mahogany, cut it off and bury it, then back to the Tussa Silk, and then back to the mahogany. So I've added that in the locations of where I have the blue arrows. So that's, certainly an approach to color I have. Another approach to color I have is I will weave continuously, with a weft color of yarn that I think looks great, with maybe the inner selvage one color and then the outer selvage a different color. And then I will gradually change as the warps, because I'm weaving a lot of times with a multiple space dyed warps, is I will change my weft color, but I'll only do so one at a time. So I'll rotate the weft colors in and out one at a time as the warps advance. And what that does is it gives you a gradual change in your scarf. So it doesn't create a sharp transition. What I mean by a sharp transition is if I'm going to change two weft colors at the same time, that's going to give me a sharp transition. It's going to stand out and look very bold, like in your project. And there are reasons maybe when you might want to do that, but then there are oftentimes many reasons why I rotate just one color in at a time. And that's, again, to have that flow of transition. That's more of a gradual color change as you go throughout the project, so to speak. So, but because I didn't have a gradual color change, oh, let me just say this one thing. Because I didn't have a gradual color change with that inner weft, which was the Autumn Spice Tessa Silk from Jane Stafford Textile, I had to vary my color changes more in the other weft colors that I was using, which was the 5/2 Tencel. So, and there is an 8/2, I think there is a different 5/2 Tencel also at the Dragonfly. So sometimes I tried to, you see my view where it looks purple, and then you change it so that maybe it looks more aqua in the Dragonfly colors. So there I was changing it maybe every third repeat. So the question in chat that's coming forward is from Nancy to everybody: change each repeat rather than each pick. Yes, change within the repeat. So like, for example, in the brocade, the whole repeat of the sequence would be, the treadling starts at 1, 2, 6 times, it goes to 3, 4, 2 times, and then back to 1, 2, 6 times, and then you go to 7 and 8 4 times, 5, 6 twice, back up to 7 and 8 4 times, back down to 5, 6 twice, and then back up to 7 and 8 4 times. So that's what I mean by a whole repeat of whatever the treadling sequence is. So Nancy and to everybody. So, okay. So at this point, I'll have Laura stop the share, but now I want to talk about color on my loom and show you some samples on my loom. I'm going to flip my camera around just for a second. So that's my studio right now, and this is my surroundings. So I'm going to stop my video because I'm going to get up and walk over to the studio and put my camera in the LED light. So you'll be able to hear my voice, but I just don't want to make everybody dizzy. So, and hopefully you've printed out the workshop instructions that I sent to everybody yesterday. They're just basically 2 pages of instructions. And so that you have that handy for taking notes, asking questions. And I'll definitely show you a picture of that. All right, so my loom is spotlighted. So you should see, did everybody just see that I enlarged that?
Yep.
Good, because I want you to be able to see it as close up as possible. Also, I'm going to start out by talking about crackle. And at the top of your instructions, you should have the ones that say workshop instructions. And basically it gives you the instructions for what to do with samples 1, 2, 3, and 4. And by the way, 4 is the same treadling as sample 2, but you are going to reverse your light and dark colors. So let me talk about, in this case, the crackle is got longer blocks. What I mean by that is in Stubenetsky's book, the blocks are different than other deflected double weaves like brocade in that they usually extend over 6 shafts. So for example, what is block A in this case, and that's what I've got on my outer selvages or outer, not outer selvages, but the outer weaving is block A, and then block A is over here as well. So in block A, in this case, is treadled as 2-1-2-1, 6-5-6-5, 3-4-3-4, 6-5-6-5. All right. Then, of course, I have block B, which is here and here in my draft. Now, and I will say, I have chosen a threading to divide my blocks, and oftentimes the yarn that is threaded on shafts 2 and 1 can help break up and divide your blocks. They can be threaded on one of the same colors as your warp yarns or a different color. I just chose to show them in a different color. It makes for an interesting design pattern, and it helps to break up the blocks, I think, so that you can see them a little bit better. And then block C is here in the center. So that's just a little bit, I mean, it's not detailing every block, but that's a little bit about, if you look back at your instructions for treadling, that's why it looks so different, is because the blocks are much longer and they extend over more shafts. Okay, here is the same threading woven with a 5-2 tencel and an 8-2 tencel. So I wanted this is a runner, so to speak. So if you've set up your yarns on Crackle with a lot of 5-2 cotton, the weight is going to be more appropriate, set at 20 EPI for a table runner. There's not really anything you can do to help the drape of that, so to speak, to be flowy, other than if you used a tencel weft or maybe a weft with wool. So hopefully if you set it up with all cotton, you are thinking about weaving maybe a table runner or a runner of some kind. If you set it up with tencel, then you're going to get a nice drape for a scarf. But here are the different blocks, so to speak. And just so when we're talking, I sometimes refer to this as the honeycomb. It kind of makes a honeycomb shape. Sometimes I'm referring to this as a tic-tac-toe board with the crosses. So you might hear me refer to that. And then, I don't know this, I just refer to that as the little squares or circles in the trapezoid. So here is what an inner and outer selvage looks like. So the inner selvage in this case is the blue yarn. The outer selvage is the cream yarn. This is what it looked like on the face of the cloth as I'm weaving. This is what it happens to look like at the back. Okay. Now let's go to what's on my loom. So these were mostly solid colors with a little bit, one hand dyed of green threaded on 2 and 1 every once in a while. But the beauty of it, as you know, I love to weave with space dyed warps. So here's what I've set up. I have 2 warps that were ice dyed by Linda Ely of Island Fiberworks at the Outer Banks. I recently taught a workshop there, and so she ice dyed and dyed a lot of warps that people could use during the workshop. So I've purchased one that is overall light, and I've got that threaded at the selvage, and it's kind of changing from grays to golden green colors. Then I've got a darker ice dyed yarn. So I've threaded that here in my block A's. I also went back and repeated that in the center block with just the darker yarn. Then I've got a navy 8/2 tencel. This is all tencel, except for I've got also, I taught a class at the Tabby Tree, which is a yarn shop about a couple hours south of here in Indianapolis. And the owner, Sandy Lemons, hand dyed a rayon, an 8/2 rayon that was a space dyed warp for many years. So I've used that also in block B, and then I've continued with that in block C as well, but this time it's interacting with one of the space dyed or ice dyed warps. So let me do a demonstration first, and then I will unroll it so we can look at some of the different blocks. But if you look here, see here, let me. You can see the inner and outer selvage. This is the outer selvage here, which is kind of gold color. And right now, I've got a yellow yarn straw, and it's traveling from outer selvage to outer selvage. So it's right at the edge of the selvage here. So can you see that yarn I'm holding up? Somebody give me a yes or.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, sorry.
All right.
Concentrating.
Okay. And you see this other yarn here? Look how I'm kind of picking it up and separating the 2 selvages. I can put my finger in between. So this is an olive, solid olive, and that's the darker in color value of the 2 yarns. And right now I have that interacting as the inner selvage. Okay, so what's going to happen is I'm going to, right now I'm treadling in your instructions, I'm treadling sample 2. So when I'm going to put my darker, do you notice how the colors are very similar here? I'm going to put my darker of the 2 right here, which is the olive, and I'm going to put my lighter color here, which is in this case straw. So here's a little bit about what's happening. Remember, this yarn is at the surface of my cloth. It is between the inner and outer selvage. It's not going across. So that's the one I'm weaving with. So I'm going to start out my treadling by 8/7. And I don't have to do any shuttle diving here because I've left it on the surface of the cloth. And what's happening is all the outer selvage yarns are down when I press on treadle 7 or 8 in this case. Oops, would be good if I beat that in. So I'm going to weave just 4 picks. It's naturally going and weaving from inner selvage to inner selvage with the olive. I'm going to leave it on the surface of my loom and pick up my other shuttle. I'm going to place it down closest to the beater board. I'm going to go down to 4 and 3. And when I pick up that colored yarn, I'm going to weave 4 picks, and it is weaving outer selvage to outer selvage. But look what's happening with the inner selvage wet floats. All of them are up when I'm back here weaving 4-3, 4-3. So that when all of the inner selvage yarn threads are up, that is when I'm going to leave this thread on the surface of the cloth. because it's going to follow along and make a weft float. Excuse me, make a warp float on the next treadling. That's what it's doing right here. It's making little floats. So I'm going back up to 6 and 5. And oh, look what happens here. It's going to make a warp float. And it looks nice with the inner selvage yarn color, the ice dyed part. But when I press on treadle 6, which is the next treadling, I find that some of them are up on the upper part of the shed and some of them are down. So I'm going to have to go in from the top this time so that it catches on that inner selvage yarn. And I just have to do it on the first pick and the last pick. I'm going to return it back to the surface of the cloth. You see how I just went back up in and just put it back in between that inner and outer selvage because there's a color difference there, and go back down to 4-3. So you have to be paying attention to what's happening. And I'm just going to go back and repeat that. No shuttle diving there, but it just, again, when I'm on treadle 8, all my outer selvage yarns are down. And all my inner selvage yarns are, well, not all of them. Half of them are up and half of them are down. That's why they're catching on that to create the inner selvage. Going to go back down to 4-3. Notice that I left my inner selvage yarn up on the surface of the cloth. I'm going to come right back to it here in a minute when I hit 6 and 5 treadles. Treadle 6 and 5. Now I have to dive back down in between the two. 6 and 5. Only have to do it when first entering that first weft pick. And then the last weft pick, which is here now, I'm going to bring it back up to the surface of the cloth. And that's so it can make these warp floats or fall in line with these warp floats. There might be sometimes when you weave this that the opposite is happening, and you might want to have that yarn traveling to the back of the cloth. I'll certainly demonstrate that when we see brocade.
It's magical.
It's so much fun. And this is once you get past the threading and your color choices on Crackle, it's really actually pretty easy weaving. Now, I'm going to unwind this so you can see what I've done color-wise. With Crackle, the color values that you choose are going to become really, really important. And that is to show up those different structures like I talked about, like the honeycomb weave or the honeycomb look or the tic-tac-toe board. And they may not show up as prevalent right now to you, but they will show up better after washing. And again, part of it is just getting that color experiment. So here I'm treadling sample 1, and I'm choosing I'm choosing just 2 colors. I'm choosing a Ming blue, and I'm choosing, actually, it looks like a light teal. Forgot to bury in my yarn there, so I'll do that later. Then for the second block, I get kind of that honeycomb. I'm choosing to do an olive with a light gray, and I'm getting the honeycomb shape here. It's harder for you to see, but I think you can see that it's different than the squares. Here's where my color choices look really good with sample C here. I've got those square boxes here. I've got square boxes here in the center. And then I've got the honeycomb here in block B now. Also, like using that dark navy thread here to separate on treadles 1 and 2 to separate my weaving blocks, but you don't have to. I've woven it here in navy blue, but here I kept it a dark purple to keep in line with the pattern that was going on. And here's a different block, and I'm getting more of that tic-tac-toe board showing up here and here. So I'm just kind of moving throughout. And as my warp colors are changing, I'm just choosing to change, and I've got no more than 6 weft colors going on. Here's another part, and this is where the ice dyed warp is changing here, kind of like from almost like a lavender to some greens.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
Now, what I love about this, and what I do, this is what I do with a lot of my projects. Okay, so there's a lot of changes going on. I have a lot of changes oftentimes at the beginning. And then when you get toward the middle, I will have a lot of block changes and treadling changes going on. And then usually at the end. So I'll kind of measure my project as I go along. Like, okay, how many treadlings of this block equal how many inches, so to speak. So that way, if I want, I can be exacting and carry that same design at the beginning, the middle, and the end of my project if I know approximately how much work I have on, you know, which I usually do. So, but I will measure as I go along the size of the design, how many woven inches it is, and I'll just write that down on a notepad for myself. So, but look at all these colors coming together, and I know like once it's washed up, you know, it's going to be really beautiful. And then the back is just as stunning because the back is usually featuring the opposite colors. So as long as I've chosen my light and dark pretty correctly, it's going to show up, you know, with crackle. So like right now, I was just treadling. Oftentimes I don't change the colors. Well, I mean, I do sometimes, but here I changed one weft color. All right, this is what I mean by changing one weft color as your warp advances. So I'm kind of like maybe on the other end of my scarf. I've, you know, past the middle, which it's, you know, hopefully going to show up around the neck. I like to have, you know, pretty treadling around the necks of my projects when they're not all the same. So in this case, though, I've decided to, I'm treadling sample 2, so to speak, for a long period of time. But now I've just changed one weft color. I've changed weft colors from an olive and gray to an olive and straw. And the reason why I did that is because there was still olive in my warp, and it's like just a gradual, subtle change, but also this space dyed warp here of rayon, there's a lot of straw in that, as well as there's a lot of this golden color here on the outer selvage. So that makes just a beautiful transition there, but keeping with the olive, because the olive is making these little, what I call the honeycomb shapes, that'll be more deflected after washing, so to speak.
And in the middle, you're not doing any blocks at all. You're not dividing them.
Hold on, rephrase that question. In the middle of what?
In the middle of your scarf, it's just one long, the same treadling. I mean, it's different color. You know, you change the olive is the same, and then you have the straw and the other color, but there's no block division in the middle.
Actually, this would be what I would call the middle of my scarf. Are you meaning
That's
the
what
middle of the
Yes.
warp?
And I don't see any division. It's just like they're long rectangles. That's more blocks to me in the beginning, and then it's more elongated in the center part of your scarf.
Well, I guess here's at the beginning with lots of block changes.
Right.
That changed the blocks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Then I have a longer area here where I don't change the block.
Right,
So
that's what
this would be the middle, what I would call the middle of the scarf around the neck. So I
yes.
have made color changes there. I've gone from olive and gray to purple and olive to purple and gray. So they are changing.
I see them now. I see them more clearly. Yes.
Yeah. So, but just in this sample that I was demonstrating, I was weaving the same block, but I only did one color change.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
So, and that's because my painted warp was changing colors and I wanted it to be, I guess I wanted it to show up. So,
Do you ever, excuse me, do you ever use a painted warp, pull out a couple painted warps and weave them as weft?
yes, and I'll explain to that. So oftentimes, and I will show you too, let's see, on the brocade, but yes, but here's
Okay.
what you have to remember with crackle and whatever the draft is you're weaving. If there are not large areas of plain weave, like in crackle, it's a lot of warp floats and weft floats with 4
Right.
so they don't tend to show up as much
Gotcha.
because the repeat of them is so short. But what I do use is a lot of hand dyed yarns that have a little bit of color variation but they don't change value as
Right.
much.
Okay.
Like, in other words, they don't go from extremely light to extremely dark. Those areas or those types of yarns, I usually change to areas of plain weave to show up the best.
Gotcha.
Or I might use one, but again, it's not going to show up as much. I have in a sample of crackle, used it every so often. But you just have to be careful about that with your design to get your design to show up. And in this case, I wanted to showcase those ice dyed warps
Yes. Beautiful.
because, I'm going to get a lot of color change with the block changes, both with front and back.
The key
See, on the
really,
back part, you see, you get to see a little bit different color.
Right. Light,
So,
dark
we
is
can-
important.
and
Okay.
we can talk more about that when I show you my brocade, because that has larger areas of plain weave.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that, don't try it. Like, if you have something that you like and you want to try it, definitely try it. I'm just telling you in general what I have found. Okay.
Natalie, question here.
Yes.
If you have the different color that differentiated the blocks and you're as you're weaving down, when would you add that different color in versus, I know it's on 1, 2, but is it after every one of these little blocks or is it more towards like the end of the sample? Like, you're like in your sample, you've got the dark navy or the eggplant or whatever differentiation in your warp. So in your weft, when would that differentiation come in? Every time or just?
You can, the nice thing about crackle, and so I'm speaking now just about crackle, is you could throw that 2-1 in between any of the sample blocks, or you could not throw it in.
Okay.
And it doesn't always have to be a different color.
Okay.
I just chose to put in a different color so that it would help you to be able to see the block changes a little differently. And I happen to like it.
Okay.
Another weaver said, oh, that's an interesting approach to that. It helps me to bring in yet another color, but you as the weaver could choose to weave it with one of the same colors that you're weaving within the block. So I use that 2-in-1. I kind of think of it as an incidental, with crackle, like you know, you have that, you can throw that in anytime you're changing the blocks, like between what they would call like a block. So, but I don't have to always throw that in. I could simply go, but in your instructions, I do go ahead and put that in. It just doesn't always have to be the same color
Okay,
or a
I get
different
it.
color. It could be one of the colors that you're choosing.
I get it.
I
Okay,
find it helps me keep track of where I am a lot more. I have done with both, you know, not changing the color so much or putting in an additional color. So, all right. So that's a little bit about the crackle and just a quick demonstration there. I'm going to get ready to set up my camera on brocades. So, because I have different things to talk about and teach you with brocade. What questions before I walk away from the crackle and move my camera? What questions might you have more about crackle?
Well, you had, excuse me, you had us thread using all 5/2 tencel in the crackle in the
Yeah.
warp. Okay, so now for our sampling, you wanted, the sky's the limit. We can use Zephyr, we can use the wool, we can use 8/2 tencel. It doesn't all have to be 5/2.
Right.
Okay,
You're right about that. And if you find that your holes, like, or these squares are disappearing, you might, you could try putting in, rather than 4 picks, when you're using a finer yarn, you could maybe try putting in 6 picks.
I mean,
And see how that works.
I have lots of solid colors of 5/2 tencel, but I want to experiment. So yeah, I liked what you said about adding more picks than it says on the pattern.
But, and you might find that you may not have to do that. And if you want, you can send me like a picture.
Okay,
And I could, you know, better help you, like, to see if that's what you want to achieve, because you may not have to. So,
I
So, but
also
it-
have the
Okay.
metallic gimp, is that what it's called? That
Oh.
really shrinks up a lot. So I was going to try that in my sample too.
okay, and whose voice is this? I'm not able to
Kathy
recognize.
Wheeler.
I'm sorry?
Kathy Wheeler.
Okay. Now, Kathy, did you order the Made in America gold gimp yarn?
I believe so.
know?
Yeah, I believe
Okay.
so.
So they do have some different weights. So that heavier weight is one that really could be used really well with 5/2 tencel.
Okay, I don't have the heavier weight. I have the
Okay.
pretty.
And then tell me what's on your warp. Is it 5/2 tencel or 8/2?
No, it's all 5/2.
Okay.
I have three space dyed warps. Of course, 2 of them are blazing shuttles, and one is
Carpark Artisans or?
yeah. Of course, they're different lengths, even though they're, you know, Catherine always adds more length.
Yes.
Car Park is less length, so I'm like, oh. Anyway, I use 3 space dyed warps in my warp, and then the 16 is a variegated 5/2 tencel for the 16, and
Okay.
for my stripes.
It's going to be beautiful. So that in 5/2 tencel, I've woven it, and I'll show you the finished piece has sold, but I'll show you pictures
Okay.
tomorrow of that. So since you're back to your gold gimp yarn, since that is finer, you might try, like I said, they do have 2 weights of the gold gimp yarn, and I have a heavier weight, which is closer to a 5/2. So, and I would say with that gold gimp yarn, you might have to throw in 2 extra weft picks.
Gotcha.
I don't know, but a good place to maybe try it in a sample to see how it behaves is on like 2 and 1.
2 and 1. Okay.
Dividing the blocks.
Gotcha.
Because it can also be scratchy a little bit too until you wash it.
Yep. I'm going to try a lot in the samples, and then, you know, see what I like.
That's what you do.
Yeah,
That's
but
what I do.
My samples are going to be pretty small because I want to, I don't want to
And
waste
that's
that
fine,
space dyed warp.
'cause you
Yes.
and that's
Nat-
fine.
Natalie, this is Mona. I had one question still on the
Yes,
crackle.
Mona.
A very simple one. So if the warp is all 5-10 cell, but
Yes.
if you are doing a weft with, say, a 5-2 weight, or you're doing 8-2, how do you vary the picks per inch?
I vary the number of weft picks I might put in of the 8-2 so that the design doesn't get lost.
Well,
And the
if I'm,
crackle is so much design in the different blocks. It is easy, it would be easier for it to get lost sometimes, unless you add in a couple of extra weft picks for 8-2. Now, but you don't have to. You can send me a picture of what it looks like. And what I suggest is this. In your sample, have some areas, and I'll talk about this more too with the brocade, have some areas where you throw in just 4 picks of the 8-2, and then have some areas where you're throwing in 6 picks of the 8-2. So you can see the difference both in deflection and how it washes up. And that will help you. You don't have to do it very much to help you. You're doing it in your sample to help you make a decision of how, when you use that finer yarn in your sample, how you can use that, or when you can use that in your project, what you would have to do. So you're striving toward a balanced weave also, I should say. So like right now, my set is 24 picks per inch, or excuse me, my set is 24 EPI on my crackle. And I'm weaving at about 22 picks per inch. And maybe, do you remember I mentioned sometimes I have a little bit lighter beat than some weavers? Sometimes I bet if I sat down and measure it, there might be places where it might be closer to 20 or 21.
So our instructions for our crackle were 20.
Yes. If you're using a 5-2 fiber, 5-2
Right.
tensile, you're at 20 EPI. So you're probably going to strive toward a balanced weave. I would say maybe probably close to 18 to 20, no
Got
more
it.
than 20 picks per
Got
inch. Okay. And that's
Yep.
probably what you were really asking me about, Mona. I just had to throw that other stuff in there. Because it becomes important. And that's why I'm such a big sampler, you know, because, you know, I really never sampled ever before I started weaving with deflected double weave, because I never wanted to waste all these fabulous yarns that I was, you know, weaving with. But whenever I tried a new fiber, and I always sample until I know how it's going to behave, because you don't want to weave with 3 or 4 yards of it and find out, that really wasn't what I wanted to do. And now the
Right.
whole project is messed up. So that's why, and I'm oftentimes throwing in different colors of fibers, or, you know, of different fibers, because that's what I have in my stash maybe. And that's because that's what I think I'm going to need to make it work, you know, so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. If there's not any more questions about crackle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my camera and I'm going to move it over and talk to you about brocade for a little bit.
Can I ask how many people are doing crackle and how many people in this workshop are doing brocade? Laura, do you know that answer?
I do not, but what if everybody put it in the chat? Just type
Okay,
chat to everybody what you're planning on doing.
gotcha.
Who's gonna be doing the brocade?
And that will be helpful to me. But also you will find out when you see photographs of everybody's samples tomorrow, you will know what they are weaving also. But yes, it'll be helpful to you to know what each other are weaving.
Can I, this is Laura, can I ask a question about the wool? And before you, about,
Yeah, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Are you saying about the wools?
yeah, using wool. I noticed, I mean, you're using Zephyr mostly, and it's, you know, obviously, I think it's what, 50% silk, 50% wool.
Yes, it is.
Is that done for texture and for shine, or is that structural so that you can use it in the warp because the silk is stronger, as opposed to using 100%?
It's both.
Okay.
I just don't weave with 100% wool. Now I do want to weave with lamb's wool one day. I stopped weaving with 100% wool, especially with shuttle diving, because when you're shuttle diving, you want to particularly, you want to stronger yarn, and that Zephyr is, here's what I like about it. It fulls beautifully. It also wet finishes beautifully, and that it has a different sheen. In my new set chart that I've updated on the website, I have started to put the sheen of some of the fibers that I work with. And, you know, Zephyr, it has kind of a lower sheen, but what that does, I have found, is to a person's eye, is that sheen of putting a shiny yarn next to a not shiny yarn. It helps to make the pattern show up. It helps to create a textural element if you want it with finishing. So, you know, it just kind of helps create interest. Now, when I went and I first started weaving deflected double weave, I was like all about the tencel, all about the tencel. The drape that I use, here's another reasons I can give you, fabulous reasons why I love the Tessa Silk by Jane Stafford and why I love also the Zephyr. Not only can the Zephyr give you a different finishing look as far as you can decide to weave it and finish it so that it doesn't shrink up and it'll be beautiful, or you can decide to set it at 16 EPI and have more of a textural element. So it's the sheen, it's also the ability to be able to control that shrinkage. But here's what I found also about weaving with Zephyr and Tessa Silk. Those yarns are so forgiving. What I mean that is that they help to really float and fill in some of the holes and gaps that are created between your inner and outer selvage that, I don't know, they just, not only do they give a beautiful hand, they just absolutely are just so forgiving, and will really move into those areas of deflection and help fill some of the spaces. So I absolutely have become a proponent of, you know, yes, I will weave with all just tencel, but I will also throw in and weave with that Zephyr and that Tessa Silk. So when I give you like the yarns that I recommend, like for brocade, example, the one that I published in Handwoven magazine, I'm giving you my absolute favorites when I say is yarn one or gave you recommendations. That Tessa Silk mixed with a 5-2 tencel in those proportions, like for brocade, absolute favorite. Absolute favorite. As I mentioned, I had in my last class with Sacramento Weavers a couple weekends ago, I had Diane Smith. She threw that Zephyr in her sample and she was totally going to weave it with all tencel until she threw the Zephyr in the weft. And she's like, after her finished samples finished up, and I say, never make a decision about a sample until it's completely 100% dry. That's also what I will tell you all. It's just, you might find that, you know, hey, you know, I really like this and this is what I want to do. So I do want you to explore. So did I answer that question, Laura?
Yeah, you sure did. I have no Zephyr, or a little bit of Zephyr, but I have a lot of lamb's wool. And so
You do?
about trying that, but it's like the 224 lamb's wool. So I was thinking about trying that, but I kind of wanted a little bit of your ideas on that.
So I would say just try a little bit in the weft. Because you haven't put it in the warp, I would definitely recommend putting it in the weft. And I would be excited to see your results. And I would also be excited to talk to you about where you purchase your lamb's wool. Because it's,
I just got it like somebody was giving it away.
oh my gosh, because it's really expensive and I seem to have a hard time finding it. So somebody was giving it away. Oh my gosh, and they didn't know me. Oh, okay. So let me talk about brocade a little bit more. All right, so you've got your workshop instructions for brocade. All right, and hopefully you've printed those off. And also, it may not be the way every weaver will refer to it, but for the purpose of this workshop, and usually a lot of times, whatever this ones, I can't do this with Crackle so easily, but whenever I'm on treadles 1 and 2, I'm referring to that as block A, treadles 3 and 4, block B, treadles 5 and 6, block C, and then block D, 7 and 8. So this is the first sample, sample 1 that I would weave, but also on the back, it tells you also, and these are the little pictures of how many repeats for different samples. So the back has the instructions here. I'm going to talk a little bit about color also. So here is some samples with a sample that I wove recently for a project that I completed for a show as a featured artist. So I had ice dyed the warp of 5/2 tencel, and then I had mixed it with another 5/2 tencel, which was an indigo natural dyed yarn by it's a Southern Indiana dyer from Bloomington, Indiana, and her business is called Shiny Dime Fibers. So she had some Ricketts indigo 5/2 tencel that I used. And then I had a Catherine Weber workshop warp that was called Smoke and Ash. And that is threaded on 7 and 8, which makes the center of this dragonfly, so to speak. It's what I call this area in here where the dragonfly is. So when I added that Smoke and Ash, not for color pop, but for color depth, it was a lighter color yarn in value, or sometimes it went to darker, but I wanted to get a little depth of color in there. And I'll show you the back also, so you can see the back. So I'm also using about 4 or 5 different colored 5/2 tencels in there. Some have been, I would say have, a little bit of light and dark values in them. Like here's one that has light and dark values. Here, this kind of purpley area. So one of the things that I tried that I did not like in my sample, but this is where a sample can help you to inform instruction a little bit, is when I was weaving block B or treadles 3 and 4, the pattern called for 4 weft picks, and I decided I'm going to experiment with throwing in 2. On the front of the cloth or the face of the cloth, it looked great. On the back of the cloth, though, I decided that it was a little bit too floaty for me. So what I ended up doing was I ended up putting in 4 weft picks like the pattern called for there. And that helped to deflect and tie down those open floats in my final sample. So that's a little bit, too, like it can look right and finish like you want the cloth, but also you have to keep in mind, and then when you're looking at your samples tonight or, as you're, washing them up, look at how it's behaving on the back of your cloth as well. Here's another, this one was woven with, here's my sample cards, the way I keep my sample cards. So this was woven with a 5/2 tencel Aloha dyed by Catherine Weber. It was also at the center of the dragonflies. I had a fall vineyard, 16 EPI, not 16 EPI, 24 EPI because it was an 8/2 tencel. So I'm mixing the 2 weights of yarns, and then I'm using 3 different shades of Tussa silk. Here's the lighter one. And then it gets darker as you go in. These 2 are so close in color that it's just, you probably are not able to see it. If I showed you a whole bobbin of it, you would see that. But anyway, so here's my sample. Again, my favorite yarns and weights to weave with, 5/2 tencel, 8/2 tencel. Here's when you will know when your weft color choice is not conducive to what you're doing. So I had this beautiful turquoise weft. I thought, oh, that's going to be so pretty. Usually I take a lot of pictures of black and white, or take a lot of pictures and turn them to black and white so I can take a look at it. And I've got some teaching examples of this on the Deflected Double Weave with Natalie Woven Facebook group. But look at how the pattern just disappears here. All I did was change one weft color here, and this was a dark cherry. And look how
Hey, Natalie, we're losing your audio.
I didn't lose the audio.
I didn't either. I can hear her
didn't.
fine.
okay. I was going to say I'm plugged in and everything, so I don't see any issues with audio. I'll try and repeat that.
Yeah, it
Maybe
might
my
be on my
voice,
end. It might be on my end.
maybe my voice is dropping just a little bit. So what I was saying is that if you look up here where my fingers are, the pattern and design just does not show up distinctly. So if you are sometimes using your weft colors in the wrong block, that will also occur. Or it's just simply, I needed to change to a darker weft color. So I changed to a dark cherry, or black cherry is what it was called. And look how beautiful all the colors show up in the warp, as far as these are the cells of plain weave. Now remember, these are your cells of plain weave here. What's happening on the back is those threads that you've threaded on 5 and 6 are going to make the inner selvage. And I've got that Tussa silk there because it's so forgiving, because you have those long warp floats that are basically on the back of those cells of plain weave. The other thing that I did,
Is the weft all Tussa silk then? Or Tussa silk and tencel?
Tussa silk here with the light blue and the grayish denim color, and then 5/2 black cherry.
Thank you.
Because you can weave continuously if I wanted to with just 2 weft colors. That's the one thing I like about brocade. You could put on 2 or 3 space-dyed warps and weave continuously and not have to worry about splitting any ends until you run out of bobbin. You can just get a continual weave going and a continual flow. So, but I decided to stick with the black cherry because I had so many colors in this painted warp as it advanced that it was all I needed. So I stuck with the black cherry, and then I stuck with changing every so often. I would throw in some lighter Tussa silk and then the darker Tussa silk. That's where you get those color variations a little bit. And there's the back. So, and you see how those 4 picks, they just beautifully fill in those weft floats. And then you have those cells of Tussa silk plain weave, and the drape is like beautiful. It is the softest, most beautiful, my preferred fibers to mix together with this pattern. Also, I put, you don't always have to follow across. I added a design element there where I put the aloha in the center of the dragonfly just that one time. And I also, this is called threading a different color within the block, because I had large cells of plain weave here and here. I threw in 4 ends of a different space-dyed warp here and here on 3 and 4 to add a striping effect. And you'll probably see that. I don't know if I removed it out of Dropbox, but I put the draft for this in my handbook, or my workshop monograph is what I called it. So this is a sample, for my workshop monograph. Here's the sample of what I have on the loom now. So you can see I'm not going to get very much shrinkage. It's already a narrow scarf. But if you take a look here, here's where I had a variegated weft color. It just wasn't. Oh, by the way, I should say I've got a 10-4 cotton dyed by Catherine Weber here at the selvage. And then I've got an 8-2 tencel dyed by Car Park Artisans. And then I've got another 8-2 tencel, I think dyed by Catherine Weber here. So I'm mixing cotton and tencel in my warp. And here in my wefts, I've tried 2 different yarns of similar 5-2 tencel, one dyed by Catherine Weber and one dyed by Amanda of Shiny Dime Fibers. And one has a much darker value to it. And the other one has a similar value of rest in these magenta purples. So can you see those bobbins close up?
Can you shift it to the left a little?
Other way.
The other way.
There you
Yeah.
go.
So if you could see the difference in those 2.
So it's not too many color changes. It's very similar.
It is
overall
very,
color, and that
it
works.
it is very similar.
Yeah,
Yes.
it works.
Because that way I will, it will show up, and I'll show you, I'll unroll it here in just a minute and show you, okay, that's the one I'm weaving with here. So can't take that over to the other side with me. But I've also got and tried different things in the weft here. I've tried a curry zephyr. I've tried a Tussa silk, interacting with the tencel. And then of course I've got 2 different 5-2 tencels. So here is let me unroll this so you can see. So I'm not going with as wide of color changes in this, but I usually try and achieve some of my weaves with maybe, 5 or 6 different colors. So I've got some things going on here at the beginning where the warp is a little bit more orange, and then it changes to some pinks. I've got that extra striping that I put in here with a 5-2 tencel. I've got the one dyed by Catherine Weber that has a lot more orange tones here. And then the ones with more of that hot pink with like almost some navy in it. So here's the back. So I'm going for more hot more of the hot peaks, but it does have some of like, almost like some navy there with that.
Beautiful.
So, but the fun thing is, you know, when you get to see both sides together.
Mhm.
Okay, so, and I did this, and here's some different treadlings that I put in. So one of my favorite treadlings is sample 3, and it's to go back and forth from blocks A and D, A and D, A and D, and it kind of makes a half circle. So that's one of my favorite treadlings to try. Here is, you know, more of sample 2. So in deflected double weave, what you're going to get is sometimes you're going to get pocket weaves. You'll get stripes in the warp, or you can get warp stripes, as I mentioned, and then you can also get weft stripes too as well. So that's another thing that you can have happening.
Hey, Natalie, we have a question from Sandy. She was asking about the patterns. These are what you have on your loom right now are the patterns that are within the brocade packet that you put in the, is that correct? In the
Yeah.
In the Dropbox, is that correct?
Yes, they're in the Dropbox in the WIF file, but they're also in your sample instructions. Okay, my shuttle, when I unwound this, I got tangled. So just a second here. Let's see if I can save this shuttle. So I can roll it up here and demonstrate. So yeah, that so on page 2 of the workshop instructions are the different samples of treadlings that I showed. So like the half moon that I was talking about is sample 3 in your instructions. And the one where I showed the stripes was a little bit of the sample 2.
Well, the ones that you have on there presently, could you just go through them and show which they are? They do look different than in the printed paper.
They do, because they're deflect, and the reason for that is, and that's a good reason, good thing to point out. The reason why they do look so different is because of that deflection that is already naturally happening.
When it's
On
not
the
under
loom.
tension, when it's not under tension.
Well, and they're not finished here, so they look completely different when they're finished too.
So let me talk about that a
Yes.
bit more. So in the drawdown, all right, let me pull out. So in the drawdown, let's just go. So in the drawdown, your yarns that are threaded here on 5 and 6, there's 2 ends. You can't see them here. And the reason is they've already deflected to the back of the cloth, leaving those 4 ends, 8, 12 ends threaded on 3 and 4 to make these cells of plain weave on the surface. So here you see in the drawdown, what you see on the loom, it looks different because you're seeing, basically, you're not seeing these little ends. Also, you're seeing the natural deflection that takes place here. And let me show you here on the, maybe you can see it in this sample a little bit more. So in the drawdown, you're not going to see these. And these are going to, instead of looking so squarish, they do start to round a little bit. This is in the drawdown. This is what I refer to as the dragonfly with the wings here. The dragonfly is threaded on shafts 7 and 8. So in the sample here, I mostly prefer to weave this whole sequence multiple times. Then I've given you some instructions for how to weave stripes. Now, keep in mind, you get to see in this drawdown, you see the ones that are threaded on 5 and 6, like these little lines here, but you're not going to see them in the cloth because they are already deflecting to the back. Can you see that? This is what sample 2 looks like.
So what color are you using for the weft in that section there, just to kind of get an idea of what's happening here?
I'm using 2 colors. I'm using a 5-2 tencel for the weft, and I'm also using an 18-2 Curry Zephyr. Now, you're not going to see very much of the Curry Zephyr because it is mostly acting as weft floats on the back of the cloth. Here's what it's doing on the back of the cloth. It's making a lot of weft floats, and it's interacting with and catching those yarns that are threaded on 5 and 6 on the back. So that's why the drawdown looks different, is I have the drawdown set that they're probably at the same size. So they will look different. And then the half moons, which is sample 3, which is weaving blocks A and D. Here's block A. And then block D is the Curry Zephyr. Block A, tencel, and then back to block D as in dog with the Curry Zephyr. Block A, block D. So, and then the dragonfly is going back and forth from blocks D and C, D and C, D and C. These little wings are 5-2 tencel. And in this case, the other yarn on 7 and 8 is the Curry Zephyr. So, but now I'm going to weave a demonstration, and then I'll talk to you about the yarns as I weave a demonstration, if that's okay. Or if are there any more questions about the fibers?
So just in general, one last question, sorry.
Sure.
So just in general, when we're looking at the assignment, it's not the color that really matters, it's the size of the yarn, that so that when you have your drawdowns, you've got 2 or 3, depending on which draft you picked, you've got 2 or 3 colors, and it's more about the size. One is a 5-2 and the other one's an 8-2 or similar.
Yes, I try when possible to use a similar size, except for if I have a different yarn content or fiber content that I think will work because of the color, I'll throw it in, if that makes sense. So I try to have my 5-2s interact with my 5-2s. I'll try to have like an 8-2 interact with the 8-2 in the warp. But the color will matter in terms of light and dark values also. Because if you if you pick all colors that are of similar value, then your weaving design won't be distinct. And you should be able to walk away from it. Like I'm right now, I'm 3 or 4 feet away from it. And I'm looking at my screen, the same screen that you're seeing. And my weaving design is very distinct.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that. But if your colors if your design starts to disappear between the 2 different yarns, that tells me that your color values are too close. Okay? Does that make sense?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
That's why I get into experimenting with so many different fibers, because if I have something in a cotton that I think will work, and I don't have the right color tencel, then I throw it in. And I'll watch the behavior of it as I finish the sample. And then I will think about where to bring in those different fibers in my project so I get a good drape. All right, now I'm weaving on an older baby Maycomber loom. And if you've ever woven with one of these looms, I know somebody on Sunday mentioned that they had, maybe it was Pat, our coordinator on Sunday. I'm gonna try and enlarge it there. Now I want you to notice where my yarns are relative to the selvage. I have my Curry Zephyr. And it's hanging out where I last left it. It's hanging down between the inner and outer selvage on the back of the cloth. So it's going to hang down. And I usually will have it closest to me right now. I've just finished weaving the first 6 picks on treadles 1 and 2, or block A in this, which is the very first 6 picks in your drawdown. All right, so now it's time for me to weave with my Zephyr on block B, treadles 3 and 4. Now, what's happening here, I don't have to do any shuttle diving, is I'm going to weave 4 picks. I usually just need to place my Zephyr. I've advanced it a little bit further than I wanted so you can see it. But remember, what's happening in this case is it's mostly weaving weft floats on the back of the cloth. So it's still hanging down between my inner and outer selvage. My other yarn on 1 and 2 block A is at the outer selvage. I picked it up and I'm going to weave what is next in the drawdown. And if you need to write this sequence down on a piece of paper, you know, that's what some weavers do, because I know that the drawdowns are tiny. So beautiful areas of plain weave. And I need 2 more picks here for a total of 6. So I'm pulling on my yarn there a little bit more than I need to be. Place it down on my cloth, and then I pick up my Curry because I've just finished with that. And my next treadling is block D as in dog. I just lifted treadle 7 or pressed treadle 7, and look what's happening. My outer selvage yarns of that Blazing Shuttles warp is all down. My inner shuttle threaded on 5 and 6 with this lighter colored, straw colored tencel is 1 is up and then 1 is down on the bottom of the shed. If I were to go into the open shed, what would happen is, do you see I get that Curry Zephyr would loop over the outer selvage, and I don't want that. Where did I leave it? I left it on the back of my cloth. So I'm going to go from the bottom into the open shed on that first pick. And it's going to travel from inner selvage to inner selvage as I weave 4 picks of my Zephyr.
Magic.
So right now what's happening is the outer selvage is having a little bit of warp floats. I don't worry about that too much now. I'm not going to dive back down because I'm going to come right back to that, but I'm going to drop down to 5 and 6, or Charlie, so to speak. And I'm going to weave 2 picks on 5 and 6 for my dragonfly and catch on that outer selvage, pick up my Zephyr, go back and weave. Notice I didn't have to shuttle dive because it's already set up. 4 picks on 7 and 8 that the treadling calls for. And I'm going to place it again down back on the loom. Notice it catches just at the inner selvage. I'm going to pick up my tencel, drop down to Charlie, weave my 2 picks for my dragonflies on 5 and 6, go back up to 7 and 8, These 4 picks. My last pick on treadle 8, block D. So my last weft pick, I'm going to return it in between the inner and outer selvage to the back of my claw. And then I try not to loop my yarns or cross them. It goes back on my cloth closest to me. And now I'm ready to repeat the whole sequence again. So this would be my whole treadling sequence. So I'm back down on 1 and 2, block A, weaving 6 picks. Up to block B, treadles 3 and 4. Now remember, I'm weaving 4 picks now. I don't have to shuttle dive because it's mostly weaving weft picks on the back of my cloth and interacting with the inner selvage threads. Go back to block A, weave 6 picks. Remember, it's mostly weaving plain weave. Creating beautiful areas there. Most dominant yarn in this pattern. Back up to 7 again, 7 and 8. Please maybe make a notation in your notes or your treadling. This is where you have to shuttle dive up into the open shed on that block B. The first weft pick. Four picks. Place it down on my loom. Go down with my treadles to 5 and 6. Use 2 picks for the dragon wings. Back up to 7 and 8. No shuttle diving because it's already on the surface of my loom. It's weaving mostly weft floats on the surface of the cloth. Back down to repeat my dragonfly treadling. On 5 and 6. This will be the last pick. Last block ticks on block D in the sequence. So because it's my last weft pick, last time I'm going to weave on block D for a while, I'll take it down in between the inner and outer selvage so it can hang out on the back of my cloth. When I do that, I place it closest on the cloth, closest to me, whereas then my other yarn is closest to. Now, there are some people that just weave one dragonfly. You don't have to repeat. You see that a lot of times in deflected double weave. You'll see this pattern and a variation of it would be just to weave 7 and 8, 4 picks, 5 and 6, 1 dragonfly rings, or basically would just make a plus sign. Then go back to 7 and 8, and then go back to plain weave. That is another variation of this that you see quite readily, so to speak. Okay, so there it is. Do you want to see me treadle sample C?
I have a question.
Okay.
The 7 and 8, 7 and 8, the transition from 7 and 8 to the, I think it's the 2 or 3 and 4, you know, what's happening on the back side of that? Where you see furry colors.
7 and 8. Okay, I don't give you that variation.
Well, no, I meant so you have the curry color for your dragonfly area, right?
Right.
And then you go back to the crimson or that burgundy color. And then there is the section where you're doing 7 and 8, right? Or not 7 and 8. I'm sorry, 3. It's 3 and 4.
Okay, so 3 and 4 is back down here. So what's happening on the back of that on 3 and 4 is it's picking up your, it's creating mostly weft floats
Okay,
on the back of your cloth, and it's interacting to tie down those threads, which are threaded in your warp on 5 and 6.
okay.
So that's important. Like you can't just,
What's happening on the selvage? What's happening on that inner selvage? Like, is the curry being carried up across? I see it. Oh, okay.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So here's what it looks like. And you may say, Natalie, it looks like a 4th grader wove that. So here's what's happening. Okay, so very good question. Okay, so at the outer selvage, the 1 and 2 treadles are creating plain weave at the outer selvage. So remember, it's making mostly weft floats. So what it's doing is it's interacting with those 5 and 6 yarns that are threaded in the warp. And it kind of looks like a little bit like a V, because it comes, you know, down into the cloth, and it has to travel across 6 weft picks. So it looks a little bit like a V on that one side, whereas over here on the other side, it looks pretty straight, meaning that you don't see that pronounced V as much on the other side that's not doing the diving. I promise you, it won't look like a 4th grader. And let me show you a close-up. It won't look so much like a 4th grader wove it after you finish the deflection. So here's the side, and this is with tussa silk. And you see what's happening is the deflection, they just kind of move across those 5 and 6. They carry across this is treadles 3 and 4 as the weft floats. And then here's the other side of that. Okay, so it's looks similar once you wash it, because they move into place. And what I meant about those zephyr and the tussa silk is that V that you're seeing right now that looks so sharp. Like I said, it softens. And the zephyr and the tussa silk, for example, if you use those yarns they're more forgiving, and they full into those areas a little bit more. So you'll want to watch for that behavior, you know, when you take it off tension, and also when you wash it. And like I said, I promise you, when you wash it, it won't look exactly like a 4th grader wove it.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. And so that, and you know, you want to probably peek at your cloth when you're weaving it every so often. So it's good to be cognizant of what's going on the back of your cloth. And oftentimes I'll have at least 2 people out of maybe 10 in the workshop that maybe sometimes will find a threading error as they're weaving their samples. And I always say to them, just, you know, if it's not so horrific, I always say, just weave it in your samples, because they are truly just samples. If you forget to bury an end in, don't worry about that so much, because you're learning this process. So, and it is truly just a sample to inform what you want to do.
So Natalie, I have a question. This is
Yeah.
Annie. In the hand woven, you didn't talk about shuttle diving at all. Did you just do it? What did you do in the hand woven instructions?
In the hand woven instructions, Annie, they give you a limited number of space.
Yes, of course.
So what it references in the hand woven is it references one of their weavers, Elizabeth Hill. she has a demo on how to weave. And it's just because they didn't have the space to include that.
Okay, but you did do the shuttle diving on that then,
Yes, ma'am, I did.
because it looks very nice, the selvages, so. Okay, thank
Yes. Yes, good question. Yes, and it's just because that's a limited amount of space. So I did type them up and give them to them. But like I said, they have the autonomy to be able to decide, what to fit. So
Thank you.
good questions, good questions. Okay, unless you need to see me weaving and shuttle diving a little bit more, this is where I give you the opportunity to go off and weave some samples, or you probably one sample. And then we would report back 1 o'clock Central Time, that's 2 o'clock, or 2 o'clock Eastern Time, I should say. And at that time, when you report in, I want you to measure your picks per inch and tell me, be able to be away from your loom, have it written down, because not everybody has, their loom right next to where they're watching the workshop. So, and I want you to report out on that. And I'm going to measure, remember the brocade, I've got it set at I've got it set at 16 EPI for my tensile and a 24 EPI for the 5-2 tensile. And I get about, let's see here. I get about 16 to 18 EPI for my brocade.
Okay, technically speaking, when we're going off of this, are you gonna do we turn off Zoom and then you're gonna let us back in, or how does it work?
Oh, okay. So what I like to have you do, this is what I always go over with the instructions. We can turn off the recording and we leave Zoom running. But we turn off the recording so it doesn't take up space, so that at any time you can get on the Zoom and say, take yourself off mute, because you should mute. Everybody should be muted while you're away weaving, because we don't want to hear, maybe private conversations that you might have with your hubby or your dog or, And so you take yourself off mute and you say, Natalie, I have a question. And I sent you a picture, and this is Kathy, or this is Annie, and so then that tells me that I need to go and check. And then I will get back to you on the text or get back to you on the messenger, whichever way you're sending me pictures. So, but we keep Zoom running throughout the course of the workshop. And then when we come back at 1 o'clock, everybody will be in their seats at their computers or wherever you watch the workshop. And you'll have your notes written down about what your measured picks per inch is to report out to me.
Okay, one other question. For Crackle especially, if you wove it as drawn in with the colors of your warp also, would that be pretty boring? Like if you wove as drawn in, but also using your exact warp colors. Pretty boring?
Like, remember I showed you mine earlier, my Crackle with,
Right?
like people always say, Natalie, was it hard to weave for you? Yeah, it was, because I was only, weaving with, mostly solid colors and always matching,
Right.
the weft. So, I would experiment with color while you have me here.
Okay.
You just need to be cognizant of what's light and dark.
Okay, great.
And then the other time is like, I will try and choose analogous colors as much as possible. Do you know what I mean by analogous colors? I mean colors that are next to each other on the color wheel rather than complementary.
Yes.
Colors. Complementary colors are red and green, and they can make mud.
Mhm.
Like sometimes when you're weaving, even with the large work floats. But when I change colors, I might, try and stick, like with a similar, I'm cognizant of the dark and the light, but I can, I can have a light gray interacting with an olive if they're of similar value, so to speak. And those weren't very two good examples because olive is usually much darker, but yeah, I would experiment, if you're up to it. There are some people that just say, Natalie, I just want to weave it in solid colors. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. But it seems to me like while you have me here, it might be good to get like, some color, do some color exploration. Okay. So if there are no other questions, make sure you get your lunch at 12:30 or so. I usually be grabbing a bite or so then. And just like I said, if you have any questions, if something's not looking all right, take a picture, send it to me. Okay. And at this point, I'm going to mute myself. Finish them in three. I'd like for you to finish them in 3 different ways, and the samples will be hand finished. I always hand wash my samples so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'll talk more a little bit later on. Let's see, I'm getting some feedback. It may be coming from your microphone, Laura. There we go. Okay, so hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So Laura, if I can have you advance to the next slide. So here is the finishing instructions for your samples. As I mentioned, there are 3 washes or finishings that I want for you to try. And sample 1 is just wet finish in cool water with soak for 15 minutes. And then you take it out and you can put it on a towel and let it air dry. And soak, which is capitalized in the presentation, I'm referring to the soak fiber wash or soak detergent, which is Canadian, or it's a Canadian based laundry detergent. And what I like about it is very low suds, so you can see what you're doing. It also is so mild that you do not have to rinse it out. So that's one of the benefits of using soak. If you don't have soak, you may want to use just whatever you regularly use. There are other types of fiber washes.
Natalie?
Yes.
This is Julia. So I had ordered some of the soak, and so I have it, but do you use it? What's the ratio? How do you dilute it or whatever? Or do you just use it straight up out of the bottle?
You just use it straight up out of the bottle.
Okay.
So, like I'm usually doing it in the sink, and I usually do a capful, and that may be, a little bit much, Julia.
Okay.
But what I love about it is, again, it really is wonderful to use. I originally got turned on to it from a knitting store that was carrying it. And like I said, it is low suds and you really don't have to rinse it. Whereas if you are using something like a Synthropol, which is a little bit different in that a Synthropol is a color catcher, that can feel really slimy. And kind of dull your fibers if you don't rinse that out. So that's why I like soap so much, because of its.
Sorry. So in your sink, just throw a capful in with enough water to cover your sample then, right?
I usually fill up my sink. I don't know
Okay.
why, but I usually fill up the sink, probably with more, than I needed. So that, like, if like a sink holds a gallon of water, I might throw in a capful for that.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so sample 2, I'm going to immerse in hot water with soak for 5 minutes. Really let the the water, fill in the fibers. So completely, not just immerse, but just let it sitting in the water for maybe 5 minutes. And then I'm going to take it out of the water partially, and I'll show you a picture here in a minute, and lightly agitate it in all different directions. Then I'm going to air dry it, take it out, place it on a towel. That's what I do with, my samples. Or I can place it in the dryer with some towels on air fluff. I have an air fluff cycle on my dryer, or some low heat. Sometimes I get, anxious and want to see that. Sample 3, I'm going to follow the same instructions. I'm going to immerse in hot water with soak for a few minutes and then agitate. Then I'm going to take it out and place it in the dryer with towels on a medium to high heat. So, and Annie is asking the question, have I used Eucalyptus? Eucalyptus. And the answer is no, I haven't, but I think that many weavers and folks do. And so that certainly is a wonderful substitution for that. I just have gotten so attached to soak because I can see what I'm doing, but I imagine Eucalyptus is very similar. And the other great thing about soak is you could use it simply, it is a detergent, so you could use it with your other laundry if you wanted to, but I always save it for delicates, hand wovens or other delicate knitted scarves or things of that nature. So that's your 3 samples. And when it's dry, I would like for you to text me photos by 8:30 in the morning, so I can start putting together the PowerPoint so that it's easier for you to see each other's samples when we're having that discussion. So that's the way we start out our day 2. And don't forget to text me your name in case you haven't sent me your name with any previous photos before. And I always tell people, like, if you, like maybe you got behind, like a couple of people said that they got behind, and, maybe they weren't able to weave like all 3 samples. I always tell people, well, at least wash 1 sample. If that's all you have, maybe trying with sample 3. And sample 3 would be the one that I would recommend that you also try, the washing method that has the wool in it. So I always tell people, don't stay up all night, fretting over this. Just send me what you have, so that, it'll be helpful to you and the others for our discussion tomorrow. So I've got
these aren't necessarily in order then. Like if you have a sample that has wool in it, it's not sample 3, you can put it in hot water.
Not necessarily in order, but if you do have one with wool in it, use number 3 finishing method.
You got it.
Great. Okay, so I've got some pictures to kind of illustrate this and talk about it in a little bit more detail, just so you can see when I talk about the agitation. So if we advance to the next slide, Laura, I'll show you. So here's me, and I've attempted to include, so the sample that I'm washing right there, I'm using soak. So you can see it's pretty low suds. You can easily see, the water in that, and what you're doing with the washing of the sample. So, and I will say in the sample that I'm weaving that the lighter turquoise is Zephyr, and the darker color is the 5-2 tencel. This is a pattern that I tend to call medallion, which is very similar to the brocade in that it has the same threading, but a different tie-up. So also, like if you're working with something that you're worried about a color bleed, maybe it's been hand dyed and you're not quite familiar about how it's going to bleed, or maybe you're using some reds and purples from a manufacturer that you're using maybe with a white yarn. So I usually only use Synthropol if I feel like I need to, in addition to soak. So, and in that case, I would definitely be rinsing it. But So using both hands, I try to rub together in all different directions. Okay, Nancy Garden has asked a question in the chat, and she has asked, is there any reason to keep an unwashed sample? Yes. So the answer to that is yes, Nancy. If you want to keep one of your unwashed samples, perhaps do that, instead of the sample finishing for sample 1. I've done that sometimes so that, but very rarely do I do it, but I go back sometimes, like maybe if I'm doing a guild presentation. For myself, I don't tend to keep a lot of the unwashed samples, but I'm trying to think of other reasons. I suppose your picks per inch would be maybe a little bit different than off the loom, but if you ever wanted to go back and get exact shrinkage measurements, that would be the best reason, Nancy, to keep, and others to keep an unwashed sample. So, and I did say also, if you really want to be extremely detailed about your shrinkage, then I would ask that you measure all your samples before you wash them. I did forget to say that earlier. I've gotten so attuned to knowing about how much these shrink, but I really started out by taking really accurate measurements before washing, especially when I was setting things like Zephyr and differently in different projects. So you can stop. And Laura, do you have the ability maybe enlarge the screen a little bit so we can see that picture a little better? Yeah, that's great. So some people say, well, Natalie, when I'm washing it up and agitating, I'm sitting here agitating, but I can't really see the movement that you're talking about. Because I usually say, stop agitating as soon as you start to see movement. And here's a way to see it when you try and rest it on the surface of the water, which is what I was trying to illustrate with the photograph. If you can like lay your sample on top of the water and you can start to see a little bubbliness form, that's an indication that, meaning the fabric would start to bubble a little bit. That would be an indication that your yarn is starting to move, deflect, and differentially shrink. So in this case, my little circles had started to form as the tencel had started to deflect around it, and the turquoise Zephyr had started to shrink some. But others simply say you can feel the resist. So when you start to feel a change of it in your hands, that's when you know that you can stop agitating it, so to speak. And then you always want to rinse it with cool water after you remove it. And that would be to stop any of the wool-based yarns that you might be using to keep them from differentially shrinking. So rinsing it with cool water would help to preserve that. And you can lay it on a towel to dry, or as I mentioned with samples 2 and 3, I'd like you to put them or experiment putting them into the dryer. With sample 3 being, if you forgot about it and let it completely dry, then you would know what is the maximum results you can get. Because by putting it in there with a towel, it's going to agitate it some too as well. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, I have more pictures of this sample to show you. So in the upper right-hand side, or left-hand side, excuse me, is an unwashed sample. So Nancy, here's to your question about the shrinkage. And then I have a sample also in the bottom side showing that, I've gotten maybe roughly 15% shrinkage at the most on that. The sample is still wet. but you can see the change in shape of the squares in the above photos. The Zephyr starts to move around and deflect and shrink up. And so that starts to, the tencel that's in the center is more circular in shape, whereas in the unwashed sample, it's more squarish. And then the other side just tries, the right-hand side shows both the front and the back of my samples when they are drying. So still wet in that case. So, but that should, show you just an example. Now I've controlled this shrinkage by remembering I've set my Zephyr, which is in the warp and the weft, at 24 EPI. I tend to like that for this particular pattern, as well as brocade. Whereas if I were weaving another pattern or draft where I wanted a lot more differential shrinkage, such as Rose Path, I would set it at the Zephyr at 16 EPI to allow for more fulling, deflection, and differential shrinkage. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tencel and deflection. So I think the next slide has one of my favorite finishing methods, especially when I first started weaving deflected double weave. I was really interested in studying the movement or simple deflection that would take place by weaving just all of the same fiber to see, exactly, what it would do and how it would behave. So this is 100% tencel. It is the Iris 5-2 warp. It is the same warp that I actually wove for brocade that's on the cover of the Handwoven magazine. But I've mixed it in this case with a 8-2 tencel, which was a Whipple color blue 8-2 tencel. So one of my favorite finishings, and I do have, and for my longer projects, I tend to put them in a top loader. I have a top loader, and I'll actually wet finish for soak if I want a mild deflection, 15 minutes in cool water. I'll spin it dry in my top loader, and then I'll hang it to dry, or I'll lightly dry it in the dryer, and I always remove it when it's still damp. So I don't know, that to me is a big thing because, and I never make a decision either about a sample until it's completely dry. But anyways, I always remove it when it's slightly damp and let it air dry. Or a lot of times I'll try to hurry it along, because if it's 100% tencel, I'm going to be steam pressing it to get that sheen with the tencel. I'm also going to be steam pressing it to set the fibers in place or to preserve that deflection. And some weavers will ask me, well, Natalie, doesn't that take away some of the deflection? And I say, well, actually, no, I feel like it kind of sets it in place. The only ones that I really don't iron, and some weavers do, are ones that have a lot of wool in them, that I've finished for differential shrinkage. Those I don't iron, but there are some weavers that do. But if you think about it, the weave structure, it gets kind of set. I think it helps to preserve it, but considering it's in its naturalness, the structure wants to deflect and move, you're still going to be able to, it's still going to do what it wants to do. And maybe over time, you might have, you might see a need to repress, simply because tencel is, it can be a very wrinkly fiber. So anyways, that is, one of my preferred finishings for just 100% tencel garments. Okay, so if we scroll to the next slide, let's talk more about differential shrinkage. So here are the fibers that I've mixed in this. I've mixed a Zephyr, which is the teal colored. It's an 18-2 Zephyr, and it's called, I think, teal or peacock is the color. And that's the little crosses or the cross shapes or the pluses. I've mixed it also with 5-2 bamboo that was hand dyed by Linda Ely. I've also mixed it with cotton, a hand dyed cotton that was a 10-3 cotton that was dyed by Catherine Weber. So I've got those three things going on in the warp. And then I've crossed it with some 5-2 tencel and Zephyr in the weft, and a little bit of 8-2 tencel. So with differential shrinkage, I absolutely love this one, because what can happen with differential shrinkage is your selvages may appear scalloped, which can actually be a very pretty effect. And I know you're not actually seeing the selvages in this, but that can really be enhanced and actually look quite pretty. Of course, with differential shrinkage, you're going to start seeing different shapes. Your squares are going to form more circular shape, and sometimes that is why you see a generic term such as medallion applied to it. It's usually referring to what looks square shaped on the loom will eventually, with the differing fibers, will produce circles, and those circles are very commonly called medallion. Also, just remembering too, you can control your differential shrinkage by using different sets with your wool-based yarns. Okay, so I talked about that earlier, because sometimes you don't always want to have maybe 35% shrinkage. I mean, you have to weave a lot more to achieve some of those results, but it can be just, I fell in love just as much as I did with weaving with all tencel, with learning to weave and finish for differential shrinkage. So I just, I love them both equally now. I don't know, they just can produce just beautifully soft, and it just depends upon what you are going for as a weaver. So if we scroll to the next slide, I've got another example to talk about with differential shrinkage or using different yarns. So I'll have Laura advance down just for me, if you would, please. Let me talk about also more about machine agitation. So I wove some yardage for a Daryl Lancaster vest. It was an intensive garment class, and I had used a whole bunch of 10-2 cottons. I had used 8-2 tencels. There were 4 different blazing shuttle yarns, and then one I had used a hand-dyed ribbon yarn as a supplemental warp. And Daryl Lancaster really turned me on to using 210 merino Coleraine lace, and I used it as a weft only for my finished yardage. And so she really taught me a lot about machine agitation. So here's what I do with machine agitation, which I now do with my projects. So I will put it in my top loader with hot water cycle. I do have a delicate cycle. With my soak, I'll just put it right into the washing machine because it is detergent. Also, don't forget, if you are going to twist fringe for your final projects, please make sure to do so before washing. And I usually, if I'm using Zephyr, I usually try to split my fringe up so that I have some Zephyr spread out and mixed in with the other fibers, so that I don't end up with the Zephyr yarn fringe being like 2 inches shorter than the rest of the fringe.
It starts to felt too. It starts to felt if you don't.
Yes. Yeah, so that is also another good reason to mix it with the
Yep.
other yarns. Okay, so, but anyways, what I'll do, once it fills up, and so it actually fills in with, the water, I will start timing it and check it every minute once you hear the agitation cycle. And usually I find after 2 minutes, it's done enough blooming, so to speak. I don't actually see the fibers start to move, but I see enough blooming, or what I call moving into spaces. Um, Annie has asked also what happens with the front loader. And it is my understanding, Annie and others, that people usually don't have the ability to do machine agitation in a front loader like they do a top loader. And I think that may depend upon the type of front loader you have. So there might be somebody else that can come back to that and speak to that in the group a little bit more.
Yeah, it doesn't work as,
It doesn't work. Yeah, I've usually had most weavers have told me that they can't do that because they don't have the ability to, open it up and check it every minute or so. So I'll talk to you about what others I know have tried. So I check it every minute once I hear the agitation cycle, and usually after 2 minutes, I've seen enough blooming, or once if you were to certainly see any movement, I actually am able to then spin it dry. And then I take it out, I put it in the dryer on low heat with a towel, and then I remove it when it's still damp. I never let it hang, or I never let it be in the dryer until it's completely dry. And then I remove and I just kind of air hang the rest of it to dry. I always use this method for scarves, or like if it's a super long Mobius or finished projects. People that don't have a machine to do their agitation, and the reason why I like my top loader is because I feel like it does a better job of fulling and agitating more evenly than what I can obtain with my own hand. Some other people have told me that they like to do it in the bathtub, that there's actually a plunger that people use for hand washing in the bathtub. I've had some weavers in some guilds to tell me that they have used that for not having a top loader. Or you simply can use your own hands in the sink and agitate your bigger projects too as well. But anyways, this is a method that I like, my preferred method for now, anytime that for my longer projects, is to let the machine do the agitation for me. Also, there are some weavers that have spinners. I think that they're probably very useful in helping to drain excess water, maybe very quickly out of a project, and you may be able to ascertain like if there's some areas that you might need to agitate more than others. So those could be useful too, those spinners, in removing excess water and kind of examining your project while it's still wet. Okay, so I've got another example to show you of a close-up of of agitation. So this is Rose Path, and this I'm using Zephyr in it. The Zephyr is a light kind of, it looks gray in the photograph, but it's actually kind of an aqua gray in real life. And then I've used an 8-2 wisteria in the warp, dyed by Catherine Weber. So you don't see it changing very much in this, but it does change as you weave. And then also I have used a 10-2 Joy yarn. Just our yarn is what Joy stands for, not sold anymore that was hand dyed, and it kind of looks lemongrass to greenish in color. If you kind of look at that, and that's kind of in the center of the roses. So here was a sample, and one of the things I loved about this sample is it helped me. I ended up choosing in my final project a slightly different weft color where I had that fuchsia, or actually it was a red purple, and the color change was, it sometimes I will try something in the sample and I'll know after the sample is washed and dried, I think, you know, I really didn't like that color quite as much as I thought I did, and I can actually change the weft color, which is what I ended up doing this for this ever so slightly. Or sometimes I might have a cotton, and I might of like that's been from the same manufacturer, and then I'll have a tencel. This is a great thing, or a great trick I use too. I'll have a tencel, like let's say like Valley Yarns. They make their colors, you know, in the wools and the cottons and the tencels. So I've had some fun mixing when I want the same color from the same manufacturer, experimenting with you, sometimes using that to get a more color consistency when I want it. But what I was going to say about this sample is you can see how it looks a little lacy in the center of the patterns where the joy yarn is, because that's a 10 to 10 and you can see it's very open, and that was because it was set at 24 EPI when I really needed to be setting it closer to 30 EPI. But sometimes a little bit of laciness in, you know, like in this case, it only had 20 ends in the total draft that was, you know, having that lacy effect. So I could have, if it really bothered me, I could have either reslayed the whole project, or in this case, what I ended up doing is I ended up going with a lighter finishing. I had a person that already had seen the scarf as it was being woven. And so she saw the unfold version. So I simply just cut back on my finishing. Another trick, and this is a trick that I'm going to have, oh, let's see, who was I speaking with today? With the purple and the reds. The name is escaping me at this moment.
Kate.
Kate,
Yeah.
Kate, it's you, Kate. I am simply going to, like right now, Kate, after sending me your picture, Kate, I am going to have you reslay just your edges at the selvage. So that's another trick that I can do too, because sometimes it doesn't bother me to have a little bit more open, like in the center of this, because it's surrounded by the wool and I don't usually have a problem with it catching. But where sometimes I get concerned about the laciness is oftentimes at the selvage, because the selvages sometimes I find get more caught on things and want to pull. So had this particular yarn been at the selvage, also, I probably would have reslayed just the selvage so that the selvage was tighter. So that's another trick I do or use. Okay, and then moving ahead to the next slide. I talked about ironing a little bit earlier. So here was an all tencel scarf, 100% tencel. And here's what it looks like on the right side where I've steam pressed it. And then on the left side, that's how it looks, oops, as I've taken it out of the dryer. So you can see it's a little bit, you know, wrinkly there, so to speak. But I really do recommending as much possible pressing it unless you finished it for differential shrinkage. Okay.
Do you
And
use
then
a
the very,
pressing cloth?
yes, I often do use a pressing cloth, and I don't have it shown here, But I do. I just use one of those silk pressing cloths, like silk organza that you get from Joann Fabric. And the reason why I use a pressing cloth is sometimes too, like just in case there's any bleed. You know, I found that that has been helpful. Most of the time I use the pressing cloth too when I'm ironing other projects. And I back them for sewing, like for garments. I use a pressing cloth a lot then too as well. So, and then the very last slide to end your time with is and let's see, this was my oops from a couple of years ago so that you can learn from my mistakes. So if we can have Laura kind of enlarge that picture just a little bit. So I was weaving with a fuchsia zephyr. Yeah. And I was, and if you go, let's see, maybe if we, are you able to scroll a little bit more toward the top? Maybe not as we enlarge it, but that's okay. It's, I think you can see it, or go ahead and enlarge it a little bit more. Maybe we can, yeah, enlarge the top. So we can see some of the top and then some of the bottoms there. Okay, so I was weaving with a zephyr. And I was also weaving with an 8-2 tencel that was dyed by Catherine Weber at the center of this scarf. And I was weaving with a 10-2 at the boundaries of the scarf where the cells are, those cells of plain weave, so to speak, and floats. I was weaving with the 10-2, and now I had different sets because, and so it was set appropriately. And I was actually going for that effect where the cells look bigger in the center of the scarf and then the other cells look smaller. So that was the effect I wanted to get. But what was happening is this was so long and it was so open and lacy that it was taking me so long to hand agitate it in the sink. And I was trying to be really careful after I'd agitated it. I removed it out of the hot water. So, you know, just like, you know, I thought I was supposed to be doing. And then as I was continuing to move along and I had gotten through half the yardage, which, and this time I had estimated maybe about a 35% shrinkage. And so, but what was happening was I noticed that the scarf that I had removed had continued to shrink. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's about 50%, 45% or 50% of the original width. And I was just like, oh, I stopped immediately. And I had a hard time with it. It was becoming, I coined it the crocodile rock because you can see around the neck, or maybe you can't see, but it is so it's so thick. It was becoming like a crocodile skin. I thought, oh my gosh, this is not what I was going for at all. But what I was forgetting to do is what I should have done is I should have had a tub of cool water that I put it into to shock it, to keep it from further shrinking. Because even though I had removed it from the hot water, it was still on the outside of the sink, continuing to differentially shrink. So anyways, I went back and, you know, fold the rest of it. But I was just sick about that when it was happening. So I saved it, you know, in some aspects, I saved it by, you know, stopping. But I just want you to, that's also why I do a lot of fulling in my top loader, because it does a more even job than what I could have done 2 years ago. But if you do have to hand wash something with wool in the sink, just remember to shock it with cool water. So, but anyways, these are, you know, some of these are experiments of how we learn. And so it's just, like I said, a learning experience that I wanted to pass on to you. Some of you that have worked with a lot of wools before were probably more comfortable, with the differential shrinkage. But at this time, 2 years ago, I was not as comfortable with it. So I always kind of, leave this with people, and I'll try and remind you about it before you work on your final projects. But that's where the sampling comes in and the washing instructions comes in, because to be able to help you to reproduce that and also to control your shrinkage as well. Because as you know, we love to weave with these beautiful, beautiful yarns, and they're expensive. So we want to be better to, hand wash a smaller sample, which I hadn't done a couple of years ago. I was trying to save my yardage, but and like I said, when it is longer yardage, I had a sample from a previous scarf that I had done. But the Zephyr, like I said, threw in a monkey wrench for this one for me. Okay, so that is what tips I have for you for washing your samples. And I look forward, this is the most exciting part for me, when I start to see the pictures come in after they're dry. So you can post them to the Deflected Double Weave with Natalie Woven Facebook group, and then I'll just grab them from there. If you don't have Facebook or you don't want to post to the Facebook group, that's fine too. Just remember to text me those finished samples, and then I will look forward to receiving them by 8:30 in the morning, and be excited to hear what you have to discuss tomorrow. So we've come to a conclusion tonight, and so we're ready to sign off for the day. Are there any questions
Yeah,
that you have?
Kate, I put a question in the chat. I seem to have trouble getting, I get kicked off and then I have to get back on. Could you just show the first slide of the PowerPoint again, where you show the difference between what you do for sample 2 and sample 3?
Yes. And then I'll go over that, because that might take a moment for Laura to pull that up. But the only difference in sample 1 and okay, so sample 1 is just a cool water wet finish. Oh, thank you, Laura. Wet finish in cool water with soap for 15 minutes and then air dry. So no agitation. Sample 2, immerse in hot water and lightly agitate it. Place in a dryer or air dry on an air fluff cycle or low heat. And then sample 3, that's the one I mentioned to have to try with your wool sample. Immerse in hot water, agitate, and then place it in a dryer with a towel on medium to high heat. Okay. Is that okay, Kate?
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Oh, very good. Very good. Okay. So tomorrow we will spend about the first hour and a half of our day looking at each other's samples virtually and talking about them. I'll be giving you tips for, maybe, where you want to go. And then I'll talk a little bit. I don't have detailed instructions for projects. It's more about picking and choosing the treadlings that you like, picking the fibers that you like, and picking, of course, you will know what finishing instruction you like by the time you've washed your samples tomorrow. And some people wind up changing their minds, I have found, which is a good thing. That's why I have you wash in samples to inform the rest of your weaving. Okay, so you guys are quiet. You've had a long day of weaving.
Natalie, I have one question.
Yes.
This is Annie. what happens if you lightly wash it or finish it, so to speak, and you decide, no, I want more deflection?
Okay, good
Can
question,
you
Annie.
rewash it in hotter water?
You can. And I've had people do that. Yes, you can. So, and especially like if you know, like if you finished that third sample already to the maximum, like you'll kind of know, you'll have a boundary to choose
Mhm.
from, like, okay, this is what it likes to its fullest. Like I
Yep.
said, to kind of quote Dara Lancaster, what's the maximum that can happen to that fabric? You know, and do you like it or not? And then
Yeah.
of course you have a moderate one. So yes,
Okay.
I have had people like sometimes, and I had that too when I first agitated my samples, which was from a round robin that I did at MAFA. You know, I wasn't agitating enough for differential shrinkage. So good
Thank you.
question for the group. All right. If there's no further questions, I'll look forward to seeing everybody, and you will be excited to see each other's samples, because I've been seeing a lot of these samples that people have been texting me, and you haven't had a chance to see them yet. So it'll be just as exciting for you tomorrow to see the other samples in the group as well.
Laura, I believe that it is the same login
Okay,
tomorrow, since I did a repeat.
okay, good. I just wanted everybody to know to use the same login that you did today for Zoom.
I'll
Okay.
double check
Alright.
if it should be different. I'll get back to you.
Oh, okay.
All right. So at this point, I'm going to sign off for the night. I see Julie waving.
Yep.
Or
thank you.
Julia. All right. And Laura. Okay. Great job, ladies, today.
Thank
Great job.
you.
Thank
All right.
you, Natalie.
Look forward to seeing you in the morning. Okay.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.